The world looked up one dawn and found space had answered back. Russian state media didn't whisper the news, they broadcast it. A ground-launched missile had struck a satellite in orbit. The projectile didn't fail, didn't graze. It obliterated it, creating a cloud of deadly debris. Moscow called it a successful test. NATO officials heard a different message, a warning that space is no longer peaceful. Satellites are the nervous system of modern society. Destroy them, and chaos moves faster than the speed of light. Satellite infrastructure guides everything we rely on. Plane navigation, financial systems, battlefield command, civilian communications. They all depend on orbiting eyes and ears. No GPS. Jets lose their way. Missiles go blind. Drones can't lock on. No communications. Armies can't coordinate. Hospitals lose records. Markets freeze. That's the power Russia demonstrated. It didn't just strike hardware. It struck connectivity. And through that strike, it shook confidence and the foundation of NATO's edge. This is precisely what President Donald Trump, now leading into his second term in 2025, had warned about. During a speech early this year, he said it plainly. The next war won't begin with explosions. It'll begin with silence, when the lights go off in orbit. Critics rolled their eyes. Space War sounded like a comic book thriller. But now, after the Russian test, those words feel less like political theater and more like prophecy. The chilling beauty of this tactic lies in ambiguity. A satellite goes dark. Was it a technical glitch? Space debris? Cyber sabotage? Governments scramble to confirm. Meanwhile, the debris clouds threaten other satellites. A military payload misses its clock signal. Banking networks glitch. Communications falter. And for NATO's generals, the suppression of space intelligence buys Russia hours or days. That window could be enough to strike again, or even begin a campaign on Earth. Russia didn't invent anti-satellite weapons, but it perfected their menace. Back in 2018, reports surfaced that the A-235 Nudol mobile missile system could target space objects. Moscow later displayed a laser system called Peresvet, meant to blind observatory satellites. Each development increased their reach, but this test showed capability. It shifted the threat from hypothetical to tangible. Behind the debris cloud is doctrine. Putin's strategic vision relies on asymmetric disruption. He might not match NATO ship for ship, but he can attack where NATO does not look, in space and data and fear. Satellites are the keystone. Remove them, and everything falls in staccato disarray. Troop movements confused. Trade routes frozen, command lines cut. NATO's might becomes frictional. That realization clashes with Trump's worldview, and yet vindicates it. This year, Trump pushed hard for the Space Force to not just exist, but to become a deterrent. He framed it not as vanity, but necessity, because if Russia or China moves first in orbit, no amount of ground power will matter. America needs a space horizon armed, not just watched. Today's environment is stark. Trump and Putin sit atop nuclear powers, but they are dancing over asset invisibility. The battlefield is no longer territory. It's orbits, wavelengths, and orbits gone silent. A single strike that severs GPS could delay troop reinforcements, confuse rescue missions, and destroy supply chains faster than tanks in a blitz. And if alliances can't coordinate, deterrence fractures. It's not fiction. Experts warn of the Kessler syndrome, an orbital domino where debris begets debris, spawning a barrier that turns lower orbit into impassable hell. That would kill civilian services, scramble military capabilities, and isolate afflicted nations. It could end global internet, satellite phone services, and real-time navigation. For countries like NATO members, it's an existential risk. Take out one satellite, and you slow reaction times. Take out 10, and you become blind, deaf, and weak. Russia tested the spark. Now NATO commanders ask, what if the spark becomes a blackout? Publicly, leaders caution restraint. Privacy concerns, planetary debris, they all come up. But behind closed doors, war games are shifting. Generals rehearse combat without sat-nav. Analysts sketch strategies for GPS-denied environments. Stock exchanges simulate milliseconds delayed pricing. Hospitals rehearse cut over to terrestrial backups. These are drills, yes, but they feel like premonitions. The Kremlin wanted this test public. It signals capacity and control. Putin understands that fear is a force multiplier. If NATO suspects satellites are vulnerable, even second-guessing costs time and unity. Trump, now defending America, must strike back with a dual strategy: resilience and retaliatory readiness. Resilience means building alternative systems, terrestrial navigation, backup constellations, rapid reconstitution networks. But it also means demonstrating the capacity to retaliate, not just with missiles, but with a return show. Disable their space edge, too, if provoked. That public readiness is a message. As morning broke the day after the test, markets shuddered, tech stocks wobbled, insurance rates flickered. In ministries and embassies, silent phone calls traced back. What did Moscow mean? Is that signal still secure? Trust, once a deep currency, wavered. So here we stand. Satellite killer confirmed. A second Trump presidency questioning the nature of war. Forces shifting in orbit and on Earth. The old rules bend and new ones emerge. Because in 2025, space is not the high frontier. It's the newest front line. The shock of Russia's test rippled outward like a seismic wave, not just in space, but across the capitals of NATO. Brussels woke to briefings that turned speculative scenarios into urgent memos. Berlin, Paris, and London convened late-night security councils. In Washington, the Trump administration gathered intelligence chiefs and military brass inside the Situation Room. The question on the table wasn't whether Russia could destroy satellites. It was how many and how fast. For decades, NATO's strategic advantage was built on a foundation few civilians noticed. The sky above. Precision-guided missiles, drones with live feeds, fleets navigating with centimeter accuracy. All relied on satellites. The Russian test didn't erase those assets, but it showed that Moscow could reach them at will. Suddenly, Europe's dense infrastructure looked fragile. Suddenly, the very technology that made NATO superior was revealed as its greatest vulnerability. President Trump, never one to temper his words, came out swinging. Putin is playing with fire in space, he said in a press conference the morning after the test. And if NATO doesn't wake up, one missile will blind the West in hours. I warned them. I warned them years ago. Now it's real. Behind the podium, he framed the test as both a threat and an opportunity. Proof that his call to strengthen America's Space Force was not political showmanship, but survival instinct. His critics bristled, but even they knew the truth. Russia had just rewritten the rules. Inside NATO, fear collided with pragmatism. Military planners drew maps not of terrain, but of orbits. They studied satellite clusters over Europe, over the Arctic, over the Pacific. Each red circle wasn't just a piece of machinery. It was a lifeline, and each lifeline in Moscow's eyes could become a target. NATO officials whispered the nightmare. If Russia disabled even 20% of critical satellites, air forces would stumble, missile defenses would falter, logistics chains would freeze. A battlefield blindfolded by a flick of Putin's hand. This wasn't paranoia. In Ukraine, Russia had already experimented with space-linked disruption. During the invasion, Russian cyber teams had sabotaged commercial satellite networks, cutting off communications to Ukrainian forces. That was a digital probe. This test was the physical escalation. And if Moscow was willing to show the world a successful strike, analysts feared it was already preparing for more. The Kremlin doesn't stage capability without intent. It signals first, strikes later. Trump's advisors pressed him to balance deterrence with caution. The Pentagon Space Command urged visible readiness, launching replacement satellites, testing anti-satellite countermeasures, hardening communications. But intelligence chiefs warned that overreaction could provoke Russia into doubling down. Trump listened, but when he returned to the microphone, his tone left no ambiguity. If Putin thinks America will sit back while he targets our satellites, he's wrong. NATO is wrong if they think appeasement works. Weakness is chaos, and I don't do chaos. The problem, however, is complexity. Unlike tanks and missiles, satellites can't be mass-produced overnight. Building, launching, and positioning them takes months or years. Russia's advantage is speed. One missile, one target, one less eye in the sky. NATO's response is resilience, spreading networks across constellations, miniaturizing satellites, deploying backups, but scaling that in time is uncertain. And uncertainty is exactly the currency Putin trades in. In European capitals, leaders face their own dilemmas. Germany, dependent on precision trade logistics, fear disruptions to GPS could grind its economy to a halt. France, with military operations in Africa, knew its overseas forces depended on satellite comms. Britain, still carving out its post-Brexit role, saw the risk of isolation if transatlantic links faltered. Each nation realized the same thing. The defense of space was no longer abstract. It was survival. Trump, meanwhile, seized the stage. He ordered an accelerated deployment of Space Force units, not just as a symbolic gesture, but as a warning. Space tracking radars lit up across the continental U.S. American allies were briefed on joint exercises simulating satellite loss. In a televised address, Trump laid it bare. Russia thinks it can cripple NATO in hours. Maybe it can, but America can cripple Russia in minutes. That's the balance. That's the truth, and that's why they won't dare. His rhetoric was fiery, but beneath it was calculation. Trump knew that credibility in space, like nuclear deterrence, rested on perception. If Moscow doubted America's will, the game was already lost. Yet NATO's allies weren't all convinced. Some feared Trump's confrontational tone could escalate the standoff. Diplomats in Brussels argued for dialogue treaties, rules of the road for orbit, but the Pentagon remained skeptical. Treaties only work if adversaries honor them, and Russia had just demonstrated, in full view of the world, that it was willing to shatter that trust literally. Putin's message was as much psychological as technical. Space is contested, and NATO can no longer take its superiority for granted. Inside the Kremlin, analysts believe Putin saw the test as leverage. He knows NATO's unity can be fragile. One threat to satellites over Europe could divide allies on how to respond. Some would push for confrontation. Others would plead for restraint. In that gap, Russia finds opportunity. And Trump's words, blunt, uncompromising, cut straight into that divide. To his supporters, they project strength. To his critics, they risk miscalculation. But to Putin, they reveal a leader who understands the value of fear. As the hours turned into days, the debris from the destroyed satellite drifted across low Earth orbit, a constant reminder of how fragile the environment had become. Commercial satellite operators voiced alarm. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station prepared contingency maneuvers. Airlines checked alternate navigation systems. All of it fueled the same conclusion. Russia's test wasn't just a weapon. It was a demonstration of control over the atmosphere of modern life. And still, the broader question lingered. What was next? Would Moscow stop at one demonstration? Or was this the opening act of a doctrine to disable NATO if conflict erupted? Trump's answer was sharp. Putin showed us a weapon. America has weapons, too. Ours are better. If Russia strikes NATO satellites, they'll regret it faster than they can blink. That promise resonated across some allies, but unease lingered. Because in space, unlike on land, deterrence isn't proven until it's tested. And a test, once launched, can spiral beyond anyone's control. For NATO strategists, the dilemma grew darker. If Russia knocked out satellites during a crisis in Eastern Europe, would NATO trigger Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause? Would the alliance treat an orbital strike as an act of war? Or would ambiguity paralyze them, giving Russia the advantage it craves? Those debates, once academic, are now rehearsed in war rooms. Trump insists America won't hesitate. But hesitation isn't just national, it's collective. And collective hesitation is the fracture point Putin seeks. The Russian test forced the world into a new reality. Space is no longer a sanctuary. It is a battlefield waiting for its first shots. And NATO, for all its strength, finds itself staring into the void, uncertain of how to fight a war where the first move is invisible, silent, and devastating. Trump may be right that only visible strength deters, but strength in space is still being built. and Moscow has already shown it is willing to strike. That is where Part 2 leaves us. A West scrambling to catch up, a president demanding strength, and a Russian leader who knows the power of fear. The satellites above still shine tonight, but after this test, they shine more like targets than stars. The satellites still orbited above, glinting like silent guardians, but after Russia's demonstration, they felt more like glass shields, fragile, breakable, temporary. NATO's generals stared at the sky with a new kind of dread, and in Moscow, that dread was exactly the point. Putin didn't need to pull the trigger again. The mere possibility that he could had already changed the balance of power. President Trump pressed the accelerator. In an address carried live across American networks, he declared that the United States would treat any deliberate attack on its satellites, or on those of its allies, as an act of war. We will not wait. We will not hesitate. If Russia or anyone else thinks they can blind America, they're wrong, and they will pay a price they can't even imagine. It was a warning meant for Moscow, but also for Beijing, for Tehran, for Pyongyang. Space was no longer a frontier. It was a battlefield, and Trump wanted the world to know America, claim the high ground. Inside NATO, the debates intensified. Was Trump's line of active war a red line or a bluff? Some European leaders feared it left the alliance cornered. One strike away from a confrontation they weren't ready to fight. Others argued it was necessary, that only hard deterrence would stop Moscow from pushing further. But behind the speeches and the press conferences, military planners confronted the raw math. Russia had demonstrated a weapon. NATO's defenses were still years away from being credible. In the short term, Moscow could disable satellites faster than NATO could replace them, and everyone knew it. The Pentagon began running simulations around the clock. What would happen if Moscow targeted GPS clusters over Europe? If NATO lost comms satellites in the Arctic? If an entire band of weather satellites was shredded into debris? Each scenario ended the same way. Disorientation, paralysis, panic. Jets lost their navigation. Missile defense radars blinked off. Troop movements slowed to a crawl. NATO forces, the most advanced in the world, were reduced to fighting like it was 1,945, blind, disconnected, deaf. And that was without Russia firing a single shot on the ground. Trump used those scenarios as political fuel. I told NATO years ago they were freeloaders, he said at a rally in Pennsylvania, his words echoing across the crowd. Now Putin is laughing while Europe hides under our shield. That has to end. We're building the strongest space force in history. But our allies better step up, because if we fight this war, it's not just America that goes dark. It's the whole Western world. The bluntness struck nerves in Berlin and Paris, but it was also the reality they couldn't deny. Without America's satellites, NATO was blind. Without NATO's solidarity, America was isolated. Space bound them together, but space also threatened to pull them apart. Putin, meanwhile, didn't need to boast. His silence was strategy. Kremlin insiders whispered to Western journalists that Russia had more tests planned, more capabilities hidden. Whether that was true didn't matter. The uncertainty itself was enough. NATO had to assume the worst, and in that assumption, Moscow gained leverage. Every negotiation, every troop deployment, every vote in the United Nations carried the shadow of the orbital strike. The space above had become a chessboard, and Putin had just moved first. American intelligence began picking up chatter of China, accelerating its own anti-satellite projects. Beijing's strategy was different, less blunt, more precise, but the end game was the same: the ability to blind an adversary at will. If Russia's test was a warning shot, China's ambitions made it clear this was not a one-off. It was a race. Whoever dominated space would dominate the century. And NATO, once secure in its technological lead, now looked over its shoulder at two adversaries instead of one. Trump leaned on history to frame the crisis. This is the Cold War all over again, he told Fox News. But instead of missiles in silos, it's satellites in orbit. Instead of tanks on the ground, it's computers in bunkers. The same rule applies. Peace comes through strength. And right now, strength means we need to control the skies above Earth, not just the skies over Europe. His framing resonated with supporters, painting him as the leader who had seen this coming while others slept. To critics, it was reckless brinkmanship. To NATO allies, it was a wake-up call they wished they could ignore. In European streets, ordinary citizens began to notice the unease. News outlets ran graphics showing how many services relied on satellites, bank transactions, air traffic control, even farming. It wasn't just about jets and missiles anymore. It was about food in supermarkets, cash in ATMs, lights in cities. If Russia attacked satellites, the damage wouldn't just be military. It would be civilizational. The modern world itself was built on orbit, and orbit was now contested ground. And this raised the most chilling scenario of all: escalation by miscalculation. What if a satellite failed naturally, but NATO suspected Moscow? What if space debris struck a French communications satellite, and suspicion turned to accusation? In a theater where attribution was murky and proof elusive, the fog of war could start in silence and end in catastrophe. Trump acknowledged this danger, but framed it differently. The only way to stop miscalculation is to leave no doubt. Putin has to know that touching our satellites is the same as touching our cities. If he doubts that, he'll take the risk. And hesitation, ladies and gentlemen, is how wars start. Inside NATO command centers, officers whispered a phrase no one wanted to say aloud. Article 5, the treaty clause that defines an attack on one as an attack on all. Was an orbital strike on a German satellite the same as a missile strike on German soil? Would the alliance really trigger collective defense over something invisible, thousands of miles above Earth? The treaties had been written in an era when space was science fiction. Now, in the glare of Russia's test, those old words looked fragile. Trump insisted that America would treat space as territory to be defended. But could NATO keep up? The answer was murky. Europe began talking about its own space shield, pooling resources to launch constellations of small, redundant satellites. France and Germany poured money into rapid launch technology. Britain pushed for stronger coordination with Washington, but all of these were years away. The present reality remained. Russia had proven it could cripple NATO in hours, and no one could stop it if Moscow chose to strike tomorrow. So NATO rehearsed. Exercises shifted from conventional drills to blackout scenarios. Generals simulated fighting without satellites, communicating with old-school radios, navigating with paper maps. The results were sobering. Forces stumbled. Coordination collapsed. The alliance built for speed and precision looked clumsy and slow. Trump's words came back again, sharper each time. Chaos is the weapon. Hesitation is the fuse. In the end, the paradox remained. The West was preparing for a war it prayed would never come. It built shields and swords in orbit while warning that no one should ever use them. It practiced drills it hoped were never real. And yet, by practicing, acknowledged the inevitability. Just as nuclear war had hung like a shadow over the Cold War, space war now hung over the 21st century. Putin had lit the match. Trump was trying to douse it with fire. And NATO stood in the middle, caught between fear of escalation and fear of blindness. The satellites still shine above tonight. They beam signals, guide flights, track weather, enable economies. But now, every one of them carries a question. How long until they become targets? The answer may never come. Or it may come in hours, on a day when the sky goes quiet, when screens go dark, when cities realize how fragile modern life truly is. And when that day comes, the words that echo will not be Putin's silence. They will be Trump's warning, shouted across capitals and command centers alike. In space, as in war, hesitation kills.